Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and it's time for another prepper talk, and I'm going to reload a little bit of 45 ACP because I have tons of this to get through. And you guys do see me kind of saying, hey, I've messed with a couple different calibers, and I'm going to move a little bit further away from 45 as far as a prep around. I'm not saying I'm not going to keep some of it around just in case, because I do have a pretty good stash of FMJs and even some Federal HST, and I do have a pair of 45s, you know, as represented by this Glock 21 SF, but I've been spending a lot of time deciding early on, even months back, of do I want to go over to the 40 S&W or the 45 ACP. I'd originally kind of decided on the 45, but I acquired some of both in order to really get a feel for both cartridges as far as reliability, my ability to shoot them, advantages, disadvantages. Reloading them is really a big deal to me. As a prepper and an avid reloader, the reloading aspect of it's a big deal, and I do a lot of high volume shooting now, and I'm doing a lot of reloading. And so for me, even cost of the reloading is actually an interesting choice. Now, people say 9mm wins out, but it doesn't from my perspective of me thinking in terms of what am I going to use it for. And I start thinking about things like prepping and everything else. I just feel like these bigger caliber cartridges bring more to the table. I just want more power than what the 9mm offers, and I'm not against the 9mm. I've shot a ton of it. I've owned a lot of 9mm. I like the cartridge. I just feel like for my overall needs for a well-rounded cartridge, I would like something a little bigger. And I came across really a fantastic deal. I've had an option to get this for a little while. I've been thinking on it. But I have a 35 Gen 4, right, as far as my Glocks go. This is interesting when I'm thinking about it from the perspective of a survival handgun. And again, this is actually my 5th 40 S&W I now have right now, all in Glocks. But it's an interesting choice because it has a lot of the merits that I've got of this lighter, slightly more compact as far as full size go versus a 40 with this 22. But when I'm really looking at it, having shot it, there is a slightly noticeable accuracy difference. I'm not going to lie, this longer sight radius, and you combine that with a longer barrel, this is a very smooth shooting weapon. Thus far, I'm fairly impressed with my ability to rapid fire this and stay on target. Again, it just overall as far as accuracy and everything else. And what's interesting is that this extra barrel, because you start talking about your EDC, which might be a 4-inch barrel or so or less, you start getting past 5 inches on a barrel like this, you're getting some substantial velocity. Now that's one of the interesting things. You know, the 40 S&W, as far as cartridges go, is a very efficient cartridge. And I feel like with this, particularly with some of the slightly slower powders that perform so well at the 40, I mean, I really need to chrono a bunch of loads with this, but a lot of people have definitely reported when they're chronoing this over even their 22s, anywhere from 30 to 50 more feet per second. Now, that doesn't sound like a lot. Again, the grand scheme of things, that's pretty minor as far as extra stopping power in a handgun at close range. But when you start talking about a prepping weapon, when you get something like this, in particular you go to hand loads, some guys are saying that extra barrel length when they go to hot hand loads is really picking up a lot of extra velocity. And people say, well, why does that matter? Because if we're going to talk about a well-rounded prepping weapon, your backup sidearm might be what you're forced to fall back to, right? You could have a malfunction in your primary rifle, you know, and you're out on foot and you're not near your home, your base of operations. You have a malfunction in your rifle, and guess what? You're forced to fall back to your sidearm. And when you start thinking about it, that ability to get that extra velocity, especially this longer barrel and with hand loads giving you the ability to bridge the gap between 10mm and 40 S&W, you're going to get a lot flatter shooting. You're going to have a better sight radius. That's going to matter if you have to go out to range. We're not talking about normal self-defense, everyday carry, civilian world, rule of law scenarios, but in a prepper situation in which you might need to take medium game for food with your sidearm. You might need to shoot at extended distance, 50 yards. That extra inch plus a barrel, that extra sight radius could really, really start to matter. Could really start to matter a lot. And then that extra velocity you're getting, that could really matter. And I think this is an interesting weapon from that perspective, because when I start weighing it out, I mean, we're down here to the point to where this is still, in a lot of ways, more manageable in terms of carrying than these full-size 45s, even to go with 10mm. And when we start looking at hand loads, good hand loads, out of this longer barrel start exceeding what off the shelf 10 millimeter does, doesn't it? Out of say a 4.5 inch barrel, right? So let's say you convert your 21 over, or you've got a Glock 20 and you're shooting 10 millimeter. Well, factory loadings, your good hand loads out of this longer barrel can start to exceed what the law enforcement stuff is for that. And I think that's what I've said before. The 40 S&W, where it really shines, is for the hand loader. And if you're going to be a serious prepper, you're probably going to be a hand loader. I feel like this weapon really actualizes the potential of the cartridge completely, because it's a very high pressure cartridge. And we end up with really good case efficiency in general. But yeah, as far as just getting that last bit of powder burn and velocity out of it, I think this brings a lot to the table. And then also when we start thinking about that extra sight radius, which again, if you're going to an RMR, might not matter so much, but if you're running something without an optic on it, this makes a difference. And I'm going to say, I did notice over shooting back to back, shooting back and forth, this was a little easier for me to group tighter than this. Actually, not this, but this one, because I shot these two side by side yesterday. And this has Trigicons on it. This one's got Trigicons, so slightly better sights versus still even these factory, well, the Glock's factory match sights. So I have to think with good sights on it, good hand loads, this will be a beast as far as the 40 S&W goes. It's an interesting choice. Could I see this being a primary sidearm for a prepper? And even for me personally, yeah, I could absolutely see it. And I mean, when we start thinking about using this even over a 45, my normal length barrel, 21, would this possibly be a better weapon? Slightly more energy? Unless I want to go to, you know, hotter loads, which might exceed standard book pressure for the 45. A little more energy. It's flatter shooting, better barrier penetration, and a longer sight radius. Oh, and 2 more rounds per magazine. This starts to become a serious contender. Now, we would oftentimes argue, you know, again, that if we're stuck with using FMJ, the 45 wins due to, you know, again, just a bigger diameter. But again, we start thinking about that flat B plate, because all of the 40 S&W, because of the nature of the round and what they did with it, are made to run flat point by default. They don't really do round those because the cartridge was never intended for that. Why does that matter? Well, that flat point matters a lot if you're going to have to take game, doesn't it? As far as tissue disruption goes. What about the same thing when we start talking about being forced to use an FMJ when you have to deal with hitting bone? That flat point is tended to do better. That's what hunters have always said over the years. So I think it's a contender as far as that goes. Still going to beat 9mm hands down. But what are we getting out of it? We're getting similar energy. In this case, possibly more. If we don't want to go to plus P pressures with the 45. Higher capacity. But again, in this case, also I've got this nice long sight radius, the long barrel. Now granted, you can get that with a Glock 41, but the 45 doesn't benefit from that as much, does it? It doesn't get as much out of a longer barrel because it's already an inefficient cartridge in a lot of ways. It has a lot of airspace in it. You don't ever get a full case fill. It's already a big bore. You know, it doesn't get as much out of that longer barrel. So yeah, I mean, it's an interesting weapon. Now, the other upside, what about versatility? People say, well, if you get stuck with that, you're still stuck with a 40. Well, there's a ton of 40 ammo out there. What are you talking about? One of the most popular, still current law enforcement rounds. It's the single most commonly used cartridge right now in law enforcement. There's a lot of that around, but the difference is you've got a better weapon system for it than most people with this longer barrel, longer sight radius. What about simple case of a couple different barrels? You know, what if you wanted to have this more versatile? Well, again, this nice long barrel would do real well with a 357 SIG, wouldn't it? You can get conversion barrels for 357 SIG, 9mm. You could have those with you in your bug out bag. It wouldn't be difficult to make this a multi-weapon system, and then now you have the equivalent of like a Glock 34. And I forget what the 357 SIG is. I think it might be a Glock 33. Is that what it is in the SIG for this longer action, the competition model? So yeah, I like it. It's an interesting choice. Could I see this being a possible best survival sidearm? Possibly. Could having some of these even eliminate a lot of the reasons I even have a 10 millimeter? Because if it comes down to it, I mean, the 10 millimeter, the recoil starts to get real excessive. This, I'm still dealing with 40 S&W recoil, and I'm just using a longer barrel to make more efficient use of the cartridge. We're still getting into 10 millimeter energy levels with less recoil, with easier to acquire components, easier to acquire brass, cheaper brass. And I mean, I could still use this and still load 10 millimeter and have some. But yeah, this is really a nice piece. And I'm going to say, having shot it, you wouldn't think that little bit of extra barrel and sight radius would matter on accuracy, but it does seem to matter. And like I said, is it enough to matter at normal self-defense distances? Not really. What if you group half-inch smaller, 7 yards, 1 inch smaller? Does it really matter? No. But what happens when you extend that out to 50 yards? Now, you're not going to be shooting a handgun in normal rule of law scenarios right now, so a lot of that advantage really becomes a moot point. Or does it? Comes to home defense, a dark room, noise, everything else, I don't know. I've got to really test it and see, does it shoot better? Because one thing I will note with the 40 S&W, there's a lot of flash and blast with the good handloads, good powder, power pistol, long shot. I have to see how much that longer barrel mitigates that. Might become a real advantage. But having just messed with this, having shot it, having one in my hands, and looking at what it brings to the table, I think the Glock 35 is a real contender as a primary survival cartridge. Now, people say, well, I'd want something a lot more concealable too. Well, you could always accompany it with one of its compact sisters or subcompact sisters. You could have a 23 or a 27. It will take the same larger magazines. No reason you couldn't have both as a workable system. But if I had to think about this also, even if you're going to open carry, now again, I'm not a big fan of open carry. I think this does bring a little more to the table though, doesn't it, than even the 22. And again, same thing, you have an accompanying piece. You can have a 27 as a backup for this. But yeah, it's an interesting choice, and I don't know fully how I feel about it. I do think it brings some nice stuff to the table. I'm going to get a lot more trigger time probably next year, not so much this year. I've got a lot of 45 stuff to get through, to where I'm really going to do quite a bit of shooting back and forth to see how I feel about it versus the 22, to see if the extra expense and even the extra, again, draw time possibly because of this longer muzzle and everything, but this is no longer than a 1911, which tons of guys have for prepping weapons. It's been taken to war. I'll see how much it really seems to bring to the table. Maybe particularly it's shooting out at a little longer distances later. But I wouldn't rule this out. The only downside, again, being cost, not as much availability, because all of my 22s were police trade-ins. I got all of them substantially cheaper because they're police trade-ins, but again, that gives you extra firearms to have around. You're probably going to have a little better parts compatibility with those. But, so there's a cost difference there. But I do feel like this does bring a little bit more to the table in certain ways. And like I said, I'll get a lot more shooting with it done. And those of you guys who like the 40 S&W, you're probably like, oh man, that's a nice gun. If you like the cartridge, I can definitely see this being a nice gun. And like I said recently, I've more or less hinted that the cartridge has grown on me a lot. And I think it's fair to say when I invest in a 35, Glock 35, the cartridge has grown on me enough that I am probably going to make it a primary cartridge. I just wouldn't see this being useful for anything but home defense, prepping, and range time unless I choose to go open carry later, which I may at some point. There might be situations later where I choose to open carry. Right now, I choose not to. I'm not a big proponent of it in a lot of situations here in Texas, but mainly that's because of where I live right now. Maybe if I lived in a slightly different area of Texas, open carry would be a more viable option. But I think where I happen to live now, not so much. I think people should generally conceal here. But again, there's cultural differences or situational differences. Again, the way certain law enforcement view it, differences in terms of who's being elected in the district, who's the sheriff, who's the representative, things like that. A lot of different factors at play. But for an open carry weapon, yeah, be a real solid choice, I think. Alright guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.